Hi everyone, my name is Christina. I'm from Germany and I'm currently studying Korea and East Asia international relations in South Korea.
Hi, my name is Charlotte. I'm also from Germany and I'm studying international management.
Okay, so today we're here because PSCORE has provided us with some questions regarding human rights and Korean reunification. So let's have a look at the first question.
What do you know about human rights in North Korea?
So human rights are already being violated on a really basic level. So I think most people know about human rights violations to a certain degree. And in North Korea especially, we can start already with child labor, women's rights, access to education or food, and these really basic rights that we take for granted are not really guaranteed in North Korea at all, even though they're part of the law in one degree or another. So the human rights in North Korea are at a standard that the international system really wouldn't find acceptable at all in most cases. And my knowledge about it is probably still limited, but I'm working on improving my knowledge as much as I can through the internship that I'm doing now. So what about you?
I think the same way. There are so many violations for human rights in North Korea, so it's impossible to tell all of them. But I think especially that the people don't have enough food to eat is a very basic human right which should be fulfilled in North Korea.
How much are North Korean human rights discussed in your country, and why do you think that's so?
So I don't really think that in Germany we talk about North Korean human rights. The only thing we hear about North Korea, what I think in the media, is just if Kim Jong-un is doing some tests, the rockets or something. Or what do you think?
Right. I think even that when it comes to Kim Jong-un specifically, usually we only hear about him if it's to kind of ridicule him or make fun of him. So people don't take him seriously, or North Korea not that seriously. And otherwise, in education or in general mass media, in my opinion, from what I know, there's nothing discussed about it unless there's a main event occurring, like some summit or a meeting or some threat to security. Then maybe people are talking about it.
Yeah, also recently, with Trump and with Kim Jong-un, then people talked about it, but only the political situation, not about human rights. What are your hopes regarding the future of human rights in North Korea?
I think we need to talk about human rights in the sense of information inflow into North Korea. So how can North Korea internally change the situation? And of course, hopefully the international community will be more interested in human rights specifically in North Korea, and then start to change the approach to how we can actually change the human rights. So I think as much as I have hopes regarding the future of it, in the end, I think we need to first find a good way to get there.
Yeah, because many people think that the solution for human rights is that we have the reunification from North and South Korea. But I don't know, because we have been sending reports to the UN, and the UN has been sending it to North Korea, and there haven't been any changes. So I don't really know if the DPRK is really going to change anything by itself, or if it is rather the other countries which should also be included in a session where this situation is discussed with the human rights and what can be done and what other countries have to do as well. So I think it is important to raise awareness for human rights in North Korea, because I don't really know if the DPRK is going to change something by themselves.
So what's your view on the reunification of the two Koreas?
Yeah, as I said, I'm not really sure if reunification is going to be the way, I mean, it certainly would help the human rights issue, but since it is kind of hard to do the reunification, so maybe we should think about other ways, how the DPRK can reach it by themselves.
I'm also maybe a little bit more critical of reunification than some other people. So I've heard nowadays that a lot of people, especially South Korean people, are talking about reunification potentially being possible over the next few decades, but I think there's, as you said, so many things to be considered if reunification would happen. So I'm worried about, for example, things I think everyone's worried about, like the economic impact and the political impact, but I'm also really worried about the cultural impact or implication of reunification. So a country like North Korea, who's so heavily indoctrinated with a certain ideology, and a country like South Korea that is extremely developed and, well, to a degree open-minded, then combining those two countries into one society, I think will be a really hard challenge.
Is Korean reunification talked about in your country?
I think the only thing they really talk about is German reunification in comparison to potential Korean reunification, and how you could learn from Germany in that regard. Otherwise, I wouldn't know when we talked about reunification in Germany.
Because as we said, like in the news, they just talk about the political situation, right?
Like, what do you think will be the greatest challenge and advantage of Korean reunification? So I already mentioned that I think one of the challenges will be to kind of combine the two cultures and the economic and the political sectors. So my question is, who's going to pay for reunification? First of all, most likely it will be South Korea and taxation. And are people really willing to do that? And then the younger generation nowadays, I feel, doesn't have much of an emotional connection anymore to the Korean War and the separation of the countries or the division of the country. So I think it will be a challenge in that regard. An advantage of the Korean reunification, of course, I mean, long term, we would hope that a unified Korea would mean larger market force, more productivity, employment hopefully would rise, and people would be able to have a standard of living, a quality of life that is much more acceptable than to a human rights standard than what's happening now in North Korea. So I think the short-term prospects are very challenging, and then hopefully the long-term will be where the advantage comes in.
Yeah, I think the same. I mean, if we think about the German reunification, for example, in the East they had less wealth than in the West, right? So the West had to pay like the tax. And it was actually until like this year they paid the tax, and actually there's still the division, but I mean they don't really know like what to do, how to solve this. And so I think there will be like a similar tax or something like that, maybe between like South and North Korea, to like solve this problem. But yeah, I think that will be like a short-term problem, but long-term it will definitely be good. Like they have more land to use it economically, and they have more labor force and stuff like that. So I think long term it will be very good for both sides economically. But I think there's also like a cultural difference, which you also talked about a little bit. Like for example, when we talked with the North Korean defector, and she said that when she came to South Korea, she didn't know like the word stress, and because when she came here, she was like so stressed out, right, with the like job competition and with the education competition, and she didn't face any of this competition in North Korea. So, like even those little things, like those little words, make such a huge cultural difference. How has your perception of North Korea changed within the last 10 years?
Last 10 years. Okay, so 10 years ago, I just finished high school, and I was getting ready to move to the UK. And I think at that time, I had no idea about North Korea or the division between the two Koreas or anything like that. And then while I was doing my bachelor in the UK, I made a lot of Korean friends, and I made a decision to come to South Korea to study for my master's. And because of that, I informed myself, of course, about Korea, and I got to know the situation. And now, during my studies and also during my internship, I'm learning a lot more about it and more in-depth about it. So my perception, I can't say my perception has changed because I didn't have a perception 10 years ago. I just didn't know anything about it. But hopefully my perception has changed in the sense that I'm aware of what is happening in North Korea as much as we can be aware, and of the human rights violations. And I'm doing my part to actively engage with it and try to make a change in a way that will hopefully have an impact in one way or the other. But how is it for you?
When I was younger, I was really interested in Asia, well, I still am. But so I was like learning about all these different countries, and then I saw North Korea, and I was like, oh, but this country is so different. Like they have, I mean, for instance, like in a kind of bad way, like negative way, but like they are so isolated, and I was interested, like how is it possible these days that there is a country like this? So I began to watch videos about North Korea and read books about North Korea. I knew a lot about North Korea before I came to South Korea, but what changed is that now I'm in South Korea, it's just much like more close to heart, because now we are like geographically we are closer, and now we're working in PSCORE, and we're trying to like help the situation, make a change. So yeah. What was the reaction of your family and friends when you decided to move to Korea?
Okay, well, I think my family's reaction is similar to most people's. They didn't know much about it, so they were wondering why I wanted to specifically move to Korea. And also, the only thing they've heard about Korea, as we just said, in Germany it's not mentioned at all, is that North Korea is potentially dangerous, so they weren't super excited about that. But because I had lived abroad before, they weren't that surprised necessarily about it. My grandma told everyone that I live in Croatia. So, people still think I live in Croatia. So that's the only reaction I've had. What about you?
So my parents are quite different. Like my father, he always wants me to like be in Germany, not to go out. So even though I have lived also in some other countries before, he was very worried about South Korea because of the North Korean border and what you hear in the news, right? You just hear about Kim Jong-un. If you hear anything about North Korea, it's just about that. So because it's so near the border, like Seoul and Iceland, he was really worried. And also back then when it was decided that I would go to South Korea, they just had the news with like Kim Jong-un like doing some tests, and also with Trump and Kim Jong-un like this kind of issues they had. So he was worried. My mother wasn't worried at all because I've lived abroad many years, so she was like, whatever, another year abroad.
Is there anything you would like to add about this topic, or?
I just hope that in the future more people are aware of the human rights violations in North Korea, because I think that's how there can be made a change.
With that, I think we need people to be more aware and to just show more interest in general about what's going on around them, especially younger people. There's a lot of performative activism going on social media nowadays, and of course I don't want to shame that, but I'm really hoping that younger people will become more interested in actually actively participating in, be it human rights organizations or just by educating themselves or by advocating for something in whichever way they think is best for them. Thank you very much for listening, and we hope you enjoyed it. If you have any interest in human rights in North Korea specifically, then have a look at PSCORE's YouTube channel down below. What's your opinion on North Korean human rights or Korean unification? We would love to hear from you, so if you're interested in participating in our campaign, then check the description box down below and we'll leave a link right there.